Hello, and welcome back to Bedtime Story. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know where you're listening from. If these stories have become part of your nightly routine, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really helps the channel. Now get comfortable, settle in, take a deep, calming breath, and let's begin. In this new story, on August 9th, 2022, the Tennessee Highway Patrol opened an investigation after receiving 3 unrelated reports involving the same stretch of U.S. play. Highway 421 near the Tennessee-Virginia border. None of the callers reported a collision, a disabled vehicle, or a crime in progress. Instead, each described encountering a dark-colored pickup truck parked along the shoulder shortly after midnight with its headlights switched off. What immediately caught investigators' attention was that every witness provided nearly identical details despite contacting dispatch separately over a period of 45 minutes. By the time the first trooper reached the reported location, the truck had disappeared. At first, investigators assumed the driver had simply continued down the highway. Over the following week, however, evidence began suggesting that the 3 motorists had not witnessed the same event at all, despite believing they had. The investigation centered on a remote section of highway crossing steep Appalachian ridges where cellular reception frequently disappeared for several miles at a time. Although the road remained well-maintained, long curves and heavy tree cover limited visibility after sunset. Traffic volume dropped significantly after 11 o'clock, leaving many drivers traveling alone for extended periods. Highway patrol records showed relatively few serious accidents in the area, making the cluster of nearly identical reports stand out immediately. Detectives began by locating the 3 motorists, all of whom agreed to provide detailed written statements before learning anything about the other reports. The first witness, a traveling nurse returning home after a weekend shift, reported passing the parked pickup at approximately 12:18 a.m. She noticed the vehicle because it appeared unusually clean for a truck sitting partially on the gravel shoulder. According to her statement, the driver's door remained closed, no interior lights were visible, and no emergency flashers had been activated. Believing the driver might need assistance, she slowed briefly before deciding not to stop because she could see no one outside the vehicle. She continued driving without giving the incident further thought until hearing about the investigation several days later. 17 minutes later, a commercial delivery driver contacted emergency dispatch after observing what he believed was the same pickup approximately 3 miles farther north. Unlike the previous witness, he recalled seeing the driver's side door standing open while the headlights remained off. He reduced speed, expecting someone to emerge from the darkness beside the road, yet no movement appeared anywhere near the truck. Dashboard camera footage from his vehicle confirmed that a pickup had indeed been parked on the shoulder, but the grainy nighttime recording failed to capture enough detail for investigators to identify the license plate or determine whether anyone had been nearby. The third report arrived shortly before 1 o'clock from a retired firefighter driving toward Bristol after visiting relatives. His description matched the previous witnesses in almost every respect except for one important detail. He insisted the pickup had been parked facing the opposite direction from normal traffic flow. Initially, investigators believed the witness had simply become disoriented while driving through the mountain curves after midnight. Accident reconstruction specialists later visited the location and determined that his description of the vehicle's orientation accurately matched physical tire marks discovered beside the highway later that morning. Troopers searched the entire section of highway before sunrise without locating the pickup. Instead, investigators found fresh tire impressions leading from the shoulder toward an abandoned gravel access road that had once served a nearby communications tower. The road ended less than half a mile later at a locked security gate overlooking a steep ravine. Officers found no vehicle beyond the gate and no evidence suggesting a truck had turned around within the narrow clearing. Drone surveys conducted after daylight confirmed there were no alternative exits, hidden trails, or recent signs of off-road travel capable of explaining where the pickup had gone. Detectives next examined surveillance footage collected from service stations, convenience stores, and highway cameras covering every possible route leading toward the reported location. Investigators expected to identify the pickup entering or leaving the area within a predictable time frame. Instead, analysts discovered that no camera captured a vehicle matching the witnesses' descriptions after approximately 11:40 p.m. before the first emergency call. Every highway connecting to the remote section had at least one functioning traffic camera, yet none recorded a dark-colored pickup during the period in question. The absence of digital evidence became one of the most difficult aspects of the investigation because it conflicted directly with 3 independent witness accounts and partial dashboard camera footage. Forensic specialists inspected the tire impressions recovered from the gravel shoulder. Measurements indicated a full-size pickup equipped with all-terrain tires, but the tracks ended abruptly where the gravel access road met exposed bedrock near the communication site. Search teams expanded their examination well beyond the immediate area, covering wooded slopes, drainage channels, and abandoned maintenance roads. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging searched throughout the following night, while officers checked nearby storage buildings and isolated cabins. No vehicle matching the descriptions was ever located. Investigators ultimately concluded that the tire impressions confirmed a truck had reached the access road, but offered no evidence explaining how it had left. Several months later, analysts completed a synchronized reconstruction using dispatch logs, vehicle telematics from the delivery truck, dashboard camera timestamps, and the responding trooper's GPS records. The reconstruction revealed an unexpected inconsistency. Based on verified travel times, the 3 motorists could not all have observed the same pickup. According to the timeline, the vehicle would have needed to travel between reported locations faster than physically possible without passing one of the witnesses who had been continuously driving the highway. Investigators carefully reviewed every timestamp multiple times before accepting the conclusion. The reports remained individually credible, yet together they described movements that could not be reconciled. The case was eventually closed after detectives exhausted every investigative lead. No missing vehicles matching the available description were reported anywhere in Tennessee or Virginia during the relevant period. No abandoned pickup was recovered in surrounding counties, and no evidence suggested that the motorists had coordinated their accounts before contacting authorities. The official report classified the incident as an unresolved suspicious circumstance rather than a criminal investigation, noting that insufficient evidence existed to identify either the vehicle or its driver. Among Highway Patrol investigators, however, the case continues to circulate during training discussions because it demonstrates how multiple reliable witness statements can sometimes reinforce one another while simultaneously making a case far more difficult to explain. For travelers who regularly drive isolated Appalachian highways after midnight, it remains one of those investigations where every documented fact appears trustworthy, yet the complete story still refuses to fit together. In this new story, on the evening of July 18, 2020, the Kentucky State Police responded to what initially appeared to be a routine single-vehicle breakdown along U.S. Route 119, a winding highway that cuts through the Appalachian Mountains. The caller reported that a sport utility vehicle had been left running on the shoulder with its hazard lights flashing, but no one appeared to be inside. Because abandoned vehicles were common along rural highways during the summer travel season, the responding trooper expected to locate the driver somewhere nearby. Instead, the investigation that followed would uncover a timeline containing nearly 40 minutes that could never be fully reconstructed, despite GPS records, surveillance footage, mobile phone data, and interviews with more than 30 witnesses. The vehicle belonged to 38-year-old Daniel Mercer, a construction supervisor from Lexington who had taken several days off to drive through eastern Kentucky before continuing into West Virginia. Credit card records showed he stopped for fuel shortly after 6 o'clock that evening before continuing south toward Pine Mountain. Security footage from the station showed Mercer alone purchasing bottled water, coffee, and a printed road map despite using a navigation application on his phone. Employees later described him as relaxed and unhurried, with nothing suggesting fatigue, illness, or concern about the remainder of his trip. The receipt timestamp became one of the most important reference points in the investigation because it represented the final, verified moment anyone could confirm exactly where Mercer had been. Traffic cameras positioned along the highway recorded the SUV passing two separate intersections approximately 15 minutes apart, matching the expected travel time between locations. Beyond the second camera, however, the route entered a remote stretch of mountainous roadway with no continuous surveillance coverage for nearly 30 miles. Emergency dispatch received the first report regarding the abandoned vehicle at 9:14 p.m. after a passing truck driver noticed the SUV sitting partially on the shoulder with its headlights and engine still running. The driver initially assumed someone had stopped to deal with a flat tire before realizing both front doors were closed and no movement could be seen inside or around the vehicle. The first trooper reached the scene 11 minutes later and immediately determined that the vehicle had not been involved in a collision. The tires were fully inflated, there were no signs of mechanical failure, and diagnostic systems later confirmed the engine had been operating normally. Mercer's wallet, mobile phone charging cable, overnight luggage, and camera equipment remained inside the SUV. His cell phone itself was missing, leading investigators to believe he had taken it with him after leaving the vehicle. The driver's side door was locked, while the passenger door had been left unlocked. No footprints were immediately visible because the roadside consisted largely of dry gravel and exposed rock. Search teams arrived before midnight and began examining the surrounding terrain. The location presented obvious challenges. Dense forest covered the mountainsides on both sides of the highway, while steep embankments limited visibility beyond a short distance from the road. Thermal drones searched until shortly before sunrise without detecting anyone matching Mercer's description. Tracking dogs followed a scent beginning at the driver's door before leading investigators approximately 150 yards downhill toward an abandoned logging road. There, the dogs repeatedly circled a small clearing before losing the scent entirely. Despite extensive searching over the following days, investigators never located additional tracks or personal belongings beyond that point. Digital evidence initially appeared more promising than the physical search. Investigators obtained location records from Mercer's navigation application, vehicle infotainment system, and cellular provider. All three sources agreed on his route until approximately 8:31 p.m. After that time, however, the records began to diverge. The vehicle's navigation system indicated continuous movement toward the eventual recovery location. His mobile phone recorded several abrupt changes in direction, inconsistent with the highway itself. Cell tower connections suggested the phone remained active for another 23 minutes before abruptly disconnecting without transmitting a final location. Analysts initially suspected hardware failure, but diagnostic reports found no indication that the phone had malfunctioned before communication ceased. Detectives next reconstructed Mercer's journey using witness interviews collected from businesses and motorists along the route. Several individuals remembered seeing the SUV because it carried an out-of-county license plate. One convenience store employee recalled Mercer asking whether the mountain roads became difficult to navigate after sunset, although weather conditions that evening remained clear. A retired couple traveling north later reported seeing the same SUV parked briefly at a scenic overlook before continuing south. Their statement aligned with available travel times and helped narrow the unexplained gap between the last traffic camera image and the discovery of the abandoned vehicle. Even with that additional information, investigators remained unable to account for nearly 30 minutes of Mercer's movements. Attention gradually shifted toward the abandoned logging road where tracking dogs lost the scent. Historical records showed the road had once served several timber operations before being closed decades earlier after repeated landslides. Engineers inspected the area, searching for concealed mine entrances, unstable ground, or evidence of recent Earth movement. Geological surveys found nothing capable of explaining a disappearance. Search crews methodically covered more than 2,000 acres using grid searches, helicopters, mounted volunteers, and cadaver dogs. Every operation ended with the same result. The only confirmed evidence remained the abandoned SUV beside the highway. Nearly 6 months later, forensic specialists completed a detailed examination of the SUV's onboard computer. Most recorded information matched what investigators already knew, including engine performance, braking history, and door activity. One data entry, however, immediately attracted attention. According to the vehicle's internal clock, the ignition system had remained active continuously throughout the evening, but the recorded travel time exceeded the actual driving distance by almost 27 minutes. Multiple engineers independently verified the calculation before concluding that the discrepancy could not be explained by idling alone. Although the anomaly was carefully documented within the final report, specialists were unable to identify any mechanical fault that could account for it. The investigation remains open today as a missing person case. Daniel Mercer has never been located, and no evidence has emerged suggesting robbery, assault, voluntary disappearance, or accidental death. Detectives continue to believe that the missing 30-minute segment of his journey holds the key to understanding what happened after darkness fell along that isolated mountain highway. Every witness statement, every digital record, and every forensic examination helped narrow the timeline, yet none explained why an experienced traveler abandoned a perfectly functioning vehicle on a quiet Appalachian road without leaving behind a single trace of where he went next. Among investigators who reviewed the case, it remains a reminder that some of the most unsettling road trip stories begin not with a violent crash or a desperate emergency call, but with an ordinary drive that simply never reached its destination. In this new story, true creepy and scary horror stories from the Appalachian Mountains. In the autumn of 2021, a 24-year-old hiker named Elias Thorne, who worked as a land surveyor, entered the dense timber of the Monongahela National Forest for a weekend trek. He intended to document seasonal soil erosion patterns along the high ridges near the West Virginia border while testing new GPS equipment in deep terrain. Local dispatch logs from that evening indicate that the weather turned abruptly and a thick fog settled over the limestone valleys without any prior warning. Elias was a seasoned outdoorsman who understood the risks of the Appalachian landscape, but he reportedly failed to check in with his emergency contact. Investigators never confirmed if he strayed from the marked path or if the shifting weather conditions simply obscured the familiar landmarks of the trail. According to archive notes from the regional search team, Elias began to experience a series of equipment failures as he reached the higher elevations. The GPS unit displayed conflicting coordinates that suggested he was moving south, while his compass indicated a steady northern heading toward the primary base camp. He eventually decided to set up a temporary shelter near a rocky outcropping because the visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. State records indicate that several other hikers in the vicinity reported hearing repetitive metallic sounds echoing through the trees during the late hours of the night. Some locals claimed that the sounds were merely the result of wind moving through abandoned mining shafts, but the county file from 2009 suggests otherwise. Elias woke up during the early morning hours to find that his heavy hiking boots had been moved precisely 3 feet away from his tent. There were no footprints in the soft mud surrounding his campsite, and the internal zipper of his tent was still locked from the previous night. He gathered his belongings in total silence while observing that the surrounding forest had become unnaturally quiet, as if the local wildlife had fled. Records conflict regarding the exact path he took to exit the forest, but Elias later stated that he felt a constant presence just behind him. The investigation concluded without finding any evidence of another person in the area, and the case remains a point of ambiguity for the local authorities. The state records from 2022 mention a second individual named Sarah Miller, who was a 32-year-old biologist studying local bat populations. Sarah was stationed in a remote cabin near the Clinch mountain range, where she spent several weeks collecting data on nocturnal migratory patterns. Her logs mention that she discovered several strange markings carved into the trees surrounding her research site during the first week of her stay. She reportedly captured several audio recordings of a voice that seemed to mimic her own vocal patterns from the previous evening. Investigators never confirmed the source of the audio, but the archive notes suggest that Sarah became increasingly paranoid about her immediate surroundings. County files from 2015 describe an incident involving a park ranger named Marcus Reed, who was 45 years old at the time. Marcus was tasked with patrolling the northern boundaries of the Great Smoky Mountains, where several campers had reported seeing flickering lights in the distance. He arrived at a clearing near a decommissioned fire tower and discovered a collection of personal items neatly arranged in a circular pattern. The items included a digital watch and a pair of spectacles that appeared to belong to a missing person from 2012. Dispatch logs indicate that Marcus requested immediate backup after hearing a heavy breathing sound coming from the darkness just beyond his flashlight beam. Some locals claimed that the fire tower was the site of a forgotten settlement, but official state records show no evidence of any historical structures. Marcus reported that he saw a tall figure standing perfectly still near the base of the tower, but the figure vanished when he approached. The county file from 2009 mentions a similar encounter involving a group of hunters who were tracking deer in the same region. These men reportedly abandoned their equipment and fled the area after witnessing a series of blue flashes emanating from the forest floor. Investigators never confirmed the cause of the flashes, and the terrain was later declared off-limits for several months following the incident. A third individual, named James Bennett, was a 50-year-old retired police officer who enjoyed solo camping trips in the Blue Ridge Mountains. In the spring of 2016, he planned a 5-day excursion through a section of the forest known for its treacherous slopes. James was equipped with a high-frequency radio and a detailed map of the region that he had used for over 20 years. Archive notes indicate that he sent a brief transmission on the second night, stating that he had found an unmarked cave entrance. The transmission ended abruptly with a sharp static noise that the dispatch center was unable to filter or identify using standard equipment. Search teams arrived at the coordinates of the cave entrance only to find that the opening had been blocked by a massive rockfall. They discovered James's radio sitting on top of a flat stone, but there was no sign of a struggle or any physical tracks. Records conflict about whether the rockfall was a natural occurrence or if it had been triggered by an external force during the night. Some locals claimed to hear a muffled tapping sound coming from behind the rocks, but the sound was never captured on official recording devices. The state records from 2017 officially closed the case as a tragic accident involving an unforeseen geological event in a remote area. Investigators later discovered a series of photographs on James's camera that depicted a dark corridor lined with what appeared to be rusted metal doors. The photographs were blurry, and the light source was insufficient to provide a clear view of what lay beyond the threshold of the cave. Dispatch logs from that period show that several unauthorized individuals attempted to access the site before it was permanently sealed by the county. The county file from 2009 mentions a local legend about a hidden facility, but no evidence of such a place exists. James remains missing, and the true nature of the unmarked cave entrance continues to be a subject of intense local debate. In the winter of 2018, a 29-year-old geographer named Thomas Vance traveled to the rural outskirts of Kentucky. Thomas was employed by a private environmental firm to map the underground water tables and limestone aquifers hidden beneath the rugged hills. He reportedly established a base camp in a valley that local residents often avoided due to the frequent presence of heavy ground mist. State records from that month indicate that Thomas made several calls to his supervisor regarding anomalous readings on his seismic detection tools. The reading suggested that a large hollow space existed directly beneath his tent, but no known maps indicated any subterranean tunnels. According to dispatch logs, Thomas reported that the ground beneath his feet felt like it was vibrating rhythmically every night at 3 a.m. He decided to document the phenomenon using a high-sensitivity microphone and a series of motion sensors placed around the valley floor. Archived notes show that Thomas recorded a sound that resembled a low-frequency hum that caused structural damage to his electronic gear. Investigators never confirmed the source of the vibration, but the county file from 2009 mentions similar reports from local farmers. Thomas was found 3 days later wandering along a remote logging road in a state of deep confusion and physical exhaustion. He reportedly claimed that he had seen a series of vertical shafts hidden beneath the thick brush that were lined with smooth glass. The state records indicate that Thomas had lost all memory of how he had escaped the valley or where his equipment went. Search crews returned to the campsite, but they discovered that the entire area had been swept clean of any human presence. Even the flattened grass where his tent had stood was now standing upright as if no weight had ever been applied. Records conflict on whether Thomas suffered from a medical episode or if he had encountered an undocumented geographic feature in the hills. In this new story, terrifying true encounters from the deep Appalachian Mountains. In 2013, 24-year-old park ranger Elias Thorne was stationed in a remote sector of the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. His primary objective involved surveying trail erosion following a series of heavy storms that had compromised the structural integrity of the local ridgelines. Thorne was an experienced outdoorsman who possessed a deep understanding of the regional topography and the inherent risks associated with isolated mountain navigation. Reportedly, he had completed hundreds of similar solo patrols without incident during his 3-year tenure with the Forestry Department. However, county files from 2013 indicate that his final scheduled check-in never reached the regional dispatch center that evening. The initial search efforts commenced within 6 hours of the missed radio contact as local authorities followed the documented route left in the official logs. State records indicate that search parties found Thorne's abandoned utility vehicle parked at a designated trailhead with his personal gear still inside the cabin. Some investigators noted that the driver's side door remained wide open despite the approaching cold front and the significant drop in ambient temperature. Archived notes from the primary search coordinator describe a scene where there were no signs of a struggle or any forced entry. Dispatch logs from that night confirm that a heavy fog rolled through the valley, which significantly hindered the visibility for the ground teams. By the morning of the second day, a group of local volunteers claimed they discovered a series of unusual depressions in the soft mud. Investigators never confirmed if these markings were of human origin or simply the result of natural erosion occurring near the creek bed. State records show that the tracks led toward a steep limestone cavern system that was not marked on any of the modern geological maps. According to several archived notes from the period, the cave entrance appeared to have been recently disturbed by something of significant physical mass. The team found a single torn piece of a standard forestry uniform snagged on a sharp rock fragment deep within the dark passage. A secondary forensic team arrived on site to examine the evidence, but they found that the subterranean environment was too unstable for a full descent. Records conflict regarding the exact depth of the shaft and whether the sounds reported by the volunteers were echoes or something more tangible. Some locals claimed they heard a rhythmic metallic scraping emanating from the limestone depths during the quiet hours of the early morning search. County files from 2013 reflect that no animal known to the region would produce a sound matching the descriptions provided by those witnesses. The official investigation eventually stalled due to the lack of physical remains and the increasingly hazardous conditions inside the crumbling cavern system. As the weeks passed into 2014, search teams expanded their radius to include the higher elevation ridges located several miles from the vehicle. Records from the county sheriff department indicate that a second-person 29-year-old surveyor named Sarah Miller also went missing nearby. Miller was reportedly working on a private land assessment project when her equipment was found neatly stacked on a granite boulder. State records show that her GPS unit had been placed on top of the stack and was still powered on when found. Investigators never confirmed why she would abandon her high-value tools in the middle of a shift during broad daylight. Archive notes from the Miller case file describe a series of inconsistent witness accounts regarding her movements on the day she vanished. Some locals claimed they saw a figure matching her description walking toward the high peaks without any of her necessary safety gear. Dispatch logs from that afternoon do not record any distress signals or calls for assistance from her assigned mobile radio unit. State records indicate that the search for Miller was eventually merged with the ongoing investigation into the disappearance of Elias Thorne. Authorities noted that both individuals were last seen within a 5-mile radius of the same unmapped limestone cavern system. During the summer of 2014, a team of specialized cave divers attempted to explore the flooded lower chambers of the mountain range. County files from 2014 suggest that the divers discovered a series of narrow tunnels that showed evidence of human occupation. Archive notes describe the presence of several rusted tools and fragments of clothing that appeared to date back several decades. Investigators never confirmed if these items belonged to recent missing persons or to workers from an abandoned mining operation. Records conflict about whether the tunnel system connects to the surface at any point other than the main limestone entrance. One diver reportedly claimed that he saw a series of deliberate markings etched into the stone walls deep beneath the waterline. These markings appeared to be a set of dates and initials, but the silt levels made it impossible to capture clear images. State records show that the diving operation was terminated early after 2 members of the team experienced unexplained equipment malfunctions. Dispatch logs indicate that both divers reported a sudden and total loss of their primary lighting systems simultaneously while in separate chambers. No technical reason for the double failure was ever identified by the equipment manufacturers during the subsequent forensic review. 14 months later, a pair of hikers in a neighboring county located a rusted handheld radio resting on a high rocky ledge. State records verify that the serial number on the device matched the unit issued to Thorne before his disappearance. The ledge was located over 12 miles away from the original search area and required a level of climbing skill Thorne did not possess. Investigators found that the battery had been removed and the internal components were completely corroded by long-term exposure. There was no explanation for how the device reached such a remote and inaccessible location without the use of specialized gear is less than hashone. Zero hash is greater than. Historical data from the county archives mentions a similar series of unexplained disappearances that occurred in the same region in 1976. State records from that era describe a group of 4 experienced backpackers who vanished while navigating the Monongahela forest ridgelines. According to archive notes, the only evidence found was a single tent that had been sliced open from the inside. Investigators never confirmed if the cuts were made by a tool or by the jagged rocks surrounding the campsite. Some locals claimed that the hikers had wandered into an area known for magnetic anomalies that interfere with compass readings. Dispatch logs from 1976 indicate that search teams were forced to retreat due to a sudden and uncharacteristic seismic event. State records show that the ground tremors caused significant shifts in the local cave systems, which altered the landscape permanently. Archive notes from the time suggest that several previously known entrances were swallowed by the shifting limestone plates during the event. Investigators never confirmed if the missing backpackers were trapped in the lower chambers when the geological shift occurred. The files were eventually closed due to a lack of physical evidence or credible leads regarding their final coordinates. In 2015, a local rancher reported finding an old leather satchel partially buried in a dry creek bed near the mountain base. State records indicate that the satchel contained a set of handwritten journals belonging to an unknown individual from 2012. Archive notes from the forensic examination described the entries as a series of meticulous observations regarding the movement of local wildlife. One specific entry reportedly mentions a large bipedal figure that the author observed watching the camp from the tree line. Investigators never confirmed the identity of the journal author or why the satchel was abandoned in such a precarious spot. The journals also contained a hand-drawn map of the limestone cavern system that featured several exits not found on modern maps. State records show that one of these exits was located near the ledge where Thorne's radio was discovered later. Some investigators questioned if a hidden network of tunnels allowed for rapid movement across the difficult mountain terrain without being detected. Dispatch logs from 2015 indicate that a brief follow-up search was conducted based on the coordinates in the journal. However, the teams found that the specific area mentioned had been covered by a massive rockfall following the 2013 storms. County files from 2016 detail a report of strange light patterns observed by commercial pilots flying over the Monongahela region. State records indicate that the lights appeared as a series of blue pulses originating from the deep mountain valleys. Investigators never confirmed the source of the illumination, although some suggested it was atmospheric phenomena common to high altitudes. Archive notes from the federal aviation logs show that the pulses did not correspond to any known ground-based signals. These reports coincided with another brief spike in local missing person cases that occurred during the same calendar month. The case of Elias Thorne and Sarah Miller remains open in the state records, although no new leads have surfaced recently. Dispatch logs from the original search are still categorized as incomplete because of the numerous reports that were never officially verified. Some locals claimed that the mountain terrain itself changes during heavy fog, making it nearly impossible for even experienced rangers to navigate. Archive notes from the lead investigator suggest that Thorne might have simply succumbed to the elements after becoming disoriented. However, the lack of a body and the strange placement of his equipment continue to fuel a sense of uncertainty. In this new story, people who went into West Virginia's woods and never came back. Many hikers believe that the deep forests of the Appalachian Range are just quiet places for weekend camping trips today. There are stories in the West Virginia mountains about travelers who walked into the trees and simply vanished forever now. This documented account follows a professional geologist who discovered a remote campsite that should not have existed at all. Gideon Vance was a 46-year-old hydrogeologist who specialized in mapping underground springs in very remote areas. He was known for his calm personality and his ability to survive in the wilderness for several weeks alone. In the spring of 2022, Gideon was hired to survey a valley near the edge of the forest. The local residents warned him about a specific ridge where the compass needles often spun in circles without any reason. Gideon did not believe in local superstitions, and he focused on the scientific data provided by his expensive digital tools. He packed his waterproof gear and hiked deep into a canyon where the cell phone signals were completely non-existent. The equipment in his heavy pack included a laser level and a high-precision digital watch that used satellite signals. He carried enough food for 7 days and a small weatherproof logbook to record his various scientific observations daily. The air in the canyon was heavy and smelled of damp moss and the ancient stone of the rising mountain. On the second morning of his trip, Gideon reached a clearing that was not marked on any of his maps. He found a canvas tent that looked like it belonged in the 1950s, sitting near a cold stone fire. There were no modern items like plastic bottles or synthetic fabrics anywhere near the small and very quiet campsite. He called out to see if anyone was nearby, but the only response was the sound of the wind through. Gideon approached the tent and noticed a cast iron skillet sitting on the rocks with fresh bacon grease inside it. He felt a sudden chill even though the sun was shining brightly over the high ridges of the deep valley. Inside the tent, he found a wooden crate containing supplies and a tattered leather journal with yellowed and fragile pages. The handwriting was neat and described a hiking trip taken by two brothers in the summer of 1954. He noticed that the local wildlife seemed unusually quiet, which was a detail he noted in his small weather logbook. The silence of the forest seemed to press against his ears as he turned the brittle pages of the old book. The final entry was dated June 12th and mentioned a strange humming sound coming from the rocks nearby that morning. Gideon looked at the ground and saw a pair of leather boots that looked brand new despite the vintage style. He picked up a newspaper from the crate and saw the headline was from the year 1954 today. He heard a branch snap behind him and turned to see two men wearing heavy flannel shirts and denim pants. The men looked confused and asked Gideon why he was wearing such strange and brightly colored synthetic hiking clothes today. They explained that they had only been camping for 2 days and were waiting for their father to return soon. Gideon realized with a shock that these men matched the descriptions of two brothers who disappeared 70 years ago today. He checked his watch and noticed that the date on his digital screen was now flickering between different years rapidly. The brothers, whose names were Alistair and Emmett, noticed the laser level on his tripod and backed away in terror. Gideon tried to explain that he was a scientist, but his voice sounded like it was coming from far away. He felt a sense of overwhelming vertigo, as if the ground beneath his boots was turning into a gray mist. He ran back toward the main trail and did not look back at the clearing or the two lost brothers. The woods looked different in the fading light, and every tree seemed to shift its position when he turned now. When he reached his truck, he found that the police were already there searching for a missing man named Gideon. The officer named Dalton Grady told him that he had been missing for over 3 weeks in the deep woods. Gideon felt like he had only been away from his vehicle for 2 hours before he reached the main road. He checked his pack and found the leather journal from 1954 sitting right on top of his maps. The final page now had a new entry that described a man in bright orange clothes who visited their camp. Gideon never returned to that part of the West Virginia forest, and he left the geology profession shortly after that. He still dreams about the humming sound in the rocks and the smell of the fresh bacon in the woods. The mountains of West Virginia continue to hold their secrets in the deep places where time does not always move. Some structures are not built of wood and stone, but are woven into the very fabric of the passing years. If you find yourself lost in the woods near the border, you should probably keep moving until the sun comes. The ending of the tale sounds fake until you see the journal and the date written in your own hand. The truth is a shadow that follows you home from the woods and stays with you until the very end. This event remains one of the most puzzling cases in the archives of the local search and rescue teams today. Witness statements from the family members of the missing brothers confirm that the handwriting in the journal is perfectly authentic. The police files include photographs of the campsite that Gideon found, but the clearing was empty when they arrived there. They found no tent and no fire and no signs of the two brothers who had been seen by Gideon. The only evidence left behind was the journal that Gideon had taken from the wooden crate during his initial discovery. Forensic analysis of the paper showed that it was manufactured in the early 1950s, but it showed no aging. The ink was still fresh, and the leather binding had not yet developed the cracks typically found on antique books. Geologists who studied the canyon reported that the rock formations contain unusual magnetic properties that might affect local electronic devices. Some researchers believe that the humming sound Gideon heard was a result of geological pressure deep within the mountain range. Others suggest that the canyon is a place where different eras overlap for a few minutes when the weather changes. Gideon Vance spent several years trying to understand the physics of his experience, but he never found a clear answer. He often visits the county library to look at the missing persons files from the middle of the last century. He found a report about Alistair and Emmett that mentioned they were last seen carrying a heavy canvas camping tent. The photograph in the file showed two young men who were the exact same people Gideon met in the clearing. Their father had also disappeared that same week and was never found by the police or the local search parties. The case remains officially open because the bodies of the brothers were never recovered from the deep and dark woods. Gideon believes that the brothers are still in the canyon waiting for their father to return to their small camp. He often wonders if they saw him as a ghost from the future or a demon from another world entirely. The memory of their confused faces stays with him, and he can still hear their voices in his quiet mind. The forest has grown over the trails that lead to that specific coordinate, and the maps are no longer accurate. The government has restricted access to the valley, citing environmental concerns and the danger of the steep and rocky terrain. Most people who live in the area avoid the mountain and tell their children to stay away from the trees. They know that the woods can take a person and hold them for 70 years without letting them grow old. The silence of the mountain is a warning to those who think they can master the secrets of the wild. If you hear a humming sound in the rocks, you should turn around and run as fast as you. Do not look for the clearing and do not speak to the men who are wearing the flannel shirts today. The past is a dangerous place, and it does not always let you return to the present day in one fort. The ending of the story is the part that stays with you when you are walking alone in the night. The mystery is the heart of the wild, and the heart of the wild is a cold and dark. Gideon Thorne is the only witness to a truth that science cannot explain or even begin to understand fully now. The archived dispatch logs from the night of his return record a man who was terrified of his own watch. The officers who processed the report noted that Gideon appeared to have aged several years in just a few weeks. His eyes were bloodshot, and he spoke in a hurried whisper about a camp that did not exist on maps. They took his statement and filed it away with the other unexplained reports from the Appalachian mountain range this year. The journal is kept in a safe at the university where researchers occasionally study the strange and fresh ink. No one has been able to reproduce the magnetic conditions that Gideon described in his detailed and very professional notes. The mountain continues to stand over the valley, and the fog still rolls through the trees in the morning. Some say the brothers are still there, and they are still waiting for the sun to go down today. The story of the surveyor is a warning to those who believe that time is a straight and simple line. It is a loop that can catch you and hold you in a moment that never ends or begins. The woods of West Virginia are deep, and they are very old, and they do not like to be. The ending of the story sounds fake until you stand in the fog and hear the sound of the rocks. The truth is in the journal, and the journal is in the safe, and the safe is in the forest is waiting for the next person to lose their way in the mist of the high ridges. The tale is told, and the listener is warned, and the cabin is waiting in the deep and dark. The story of Gideon Vance is a legacy of the unknown in the heart of the great American wild. The ending is the part that stays with you when you turn off the light at the end day. The mystery is the ending, and the ending is the mystery in the quiet woods of the mountain range. The story is finished, and the forest is dark, and the mountains are silent, and the truth is free. The geologist is home, and the camp is gone, and the brothers are waiting for their father to return soon. The ending is the beginning of the next story, in the heart of the great and ancient mountain wild. The tale of the man who saw the past in the present is done for now in the woods are calling, and the fog is rolling, and the mystery is yours to keep for a long. The ending is the silence that follows the final word of the story of the lost and the truth. The truth is a shadow in the trees, and the trees are the only ones who know the secrets. The story is done, and the fire is out, and the dark is all that remains in the fire. The forensic evidence of the journal remains the only physical proof that the brothers were ever seen after 1954. Handwriting experts compared the new entry to the older pages and found they were written by the same person. This would mean that the boy from the past wrote about Gideon in the future with the same pen today. The local sheriff continues to keep the case on his desk because it is the only one he cannot solve. He looks at the vintage boots in the evidence room and wonders how they could stay so clean and new. The valley is a place where the air stays still and the seasons do not follow the normal calendar cycles. Gideon Vance never went back to the mountains, and he never looked at another digital watch for his entire life. He preferred the steady ticking of an old mechanical clock that stayed in the present moment with him at home. The story of the disappearance is told in hushed tones by the residents of the nearby mountain town of Blackwood. They know that the woods are not just trees and rocks, but are a living part of the local Blackwood. The mystery is a gift for those who listen to the whispers of the wild and the hidden places now. The ending of the tale is the part you will remember when you are walking alone in the forest. The story is a circle, and the circle is a map, and the map leads back to the start. The truth is a fire that burns in the heart of the dark and the silence of the mountain. In this new story, every July, millions of Americans leave home believing the most dangerous part of their vacation will be heavy traffic, bad weather, or a flat tire somewhere along an unfamiliar highway. Most return with photographs, souvenirs, and stories they'll happily tell for years. Others return with experiences they rarely mention, not because no one would believe them, but because they still cannot explain what happened. Over the last 4 decades, sheriff departments, state police agencies, and local newspapers across the United States have quietly documented dozens of unusual reports connected to July road trips. None were ever officially linked together. Different states, different highways, different families. Yet, investigators reviewing the records years later noticed something unsettling. Every witness insisted their trip changed forever after making one decision they believed was completely ordinary. The first case began during the second week of July 2015. Robert and Lisa Campbell had spent nearly 6 months planning a 2-week road trip from Missouri to Yellowstone National Park. Both were recently retired school teachers who preferred scenic backroads over busy interstates. Their travel journal, recovered months later by relatives, documented nearly every stop along the journey, including restaurants, fuel receipts, hiking trails, and conversations with local residents. It would eventually become one of the most detailed records investigators had available. On July 10th, shortly after leaving eastern Wyoming, the couple stopped at a small family-owned diner where another customer suggested a little-known scenic highway that crossed hundreds of miles of open prairie before reconnecting with the interstate farther north. According to him, the drive offered spectacular sunsets and almost no traffic. Robert marked the route inside his paper atlas before thanking the man. Security footage later confirmed the conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. No one ever identified the traveler who recommended the road. The first 100 miles were exactly as promised. Endless grasslands stretched toward distant mountains, while the evening sun painted the horizon deep shades of orange and gold. Robert stopped several times to photograph abandoned barns, windmills, and grazing antelope. Lisa continued writing inside her travel journal, describing the highway as one of the quietest roads they had ever driven. Shortly before sunset, she noted something unusual. They had not passed another moving vehicle for nearly 40 minutes, despite traveling during the busiest vacation month of the year. Around 8:30, they reached a weathered service station standing alone beside the highway. Its fuel pumps had been removed years earlier, but the building itself appeared occupied. An elderly woman sweeping the front porch smiled and asked whether they were heading north. When Robert answered yes, she quietly suggested they continue driving until reaching the interstate without stopping again, regardless of what they might see along the road. Lisa later wrote the warning in her journal, adding that the woman refused to explain further before wishing them a safe trip. It seemed like an odd conversation, but neither considered it especially important at the time. Just after darkness settled across the prairie, Robert noticed headlights appearing several miles behind them. The vehicle never seemed to get closer, despite maintaining exactly the same speed for nearly 20 minutes. Whenever Robert slowed slightly, the distant headlights slowed as well. When he accelerated, they accelerated too. Curious, he eventually pulled onto the shoulder, expecting the other driver to pass. Instead, the headlights stopped almost half a mile away and remained perfectly still. After waiting several minutes, Robert returned to the highway. The distant lights resumed, following at exactly the same distance. They reached the interstate shortly before 10 and immediately noticed the headlights disappear. Relieved, they continued toward Billings without discussing the incident further. The following morning, while reviewing photographs from the previous evening, Lisa discovered something unexpected. One image captured during sunset clearly showed the highway stretching behind their vehicle for several miles. There were no headlights anywhere on the road. The timestamp matched the exact period when both insisted another vehicle had been following them. Photography specialists later confirmed the image showed no signs of digital alteration. The second case occurred 3 years later during July 2018 in northern Maine. Brothers Kevin and Thomas Riley planned a fishing trip near the Canadian border. Their route crossed long stretches of forest where gas stations became increasingly rare after sunset. Shortly after 9, they stopped at a lonely convenience store to buy coffee and ask about the quickest route to their rented cabin. The cashier looked toward the parking lot before asking whether they had seen an older green station wagon parked outside. Both brothers turned toward the windows. The parking lot contained only their pickup truck. When they answered no, the cashier quietly apologized and changed the subject. Less than an hour later, Kevin noticed an older green station wagon parked beside the highway with its hood raised. Assuming someone needed assistance, he slowed almost to a stop. Before either brother could open the doors, another pickup traveling in the opposite direction repeatedly flashed its headlights. The driver leaned out his window and shouted only 3 words, "Keep driving now." Kevin accelerated without hesitation. When they glanced back through the rear window, less than 30 seconds later, the station wagon had disappeared. The shoulder where it had been parked stretched empty beneath the moonlight. State police later confirmed no disabled vehicles were reported anywhere along that section of highway that evening. The final case came from southern West Virginia during July 2022. Emily Foster, a travel nurse from North Carolina, accepted a temporary assignment in Charleston and decided to spend several days exploring small Appalachian towns before beginning work. Unlike the previous witnesses, Emily carried a dashboard camera recording continuously throughout the trip. Shortly after entering an isolated mountain highway, she encountered a handwritten detour sign directing traffic away from ongoing bridge repairs. The route eventually led through a nearly abandoned coal community where every storefront appeared empty except one small grocery store still displaying fresh produce outside the entrance. Emily purchased bottled water, spoke briefly with the elderly owner, and continued driving. The receipt recovered from her wallet showed the purchase occurred at 4:23 that afternoon. 3 weeks later, curious about the unusual town, Emily attempted to revisit the grocery store while returning home. She never found it. Local residents insisted no grocery had operated there for nearly 15 years. Historical records later confirmed the building had been destroyed during a flood long before Emily claimed to have stopped there. Even more puzzling, the bottled water she purchased remained inside her vehicle, bearing the faded store label investigators could not match to any currently registered business in West Virginia. The receipt identified a tax registration number belonging to a company officially dissolved in 2016. No explanation accounted for how she obtained either item. Years later, a transportation researcher comparing unusual travel reports noticed an unexpected connection linking all 3 cases. None involved violence, none resulted in disappearances. Every traveler returned home safely, yet each witness received an unexplained warning from a stranger shortly before experiencing something investigators could never verify. The warnings differed only slightly. Keep driving. Don't stop. Stay on the highway. Reach the interstate before dark. No official investigation ever determined why those warnings appeared so consistently across different states separated by thousands of miles. Perhaps they meant nothing at all. Or perhaps every July, somewhere along America's loneliest highways, ordinary travelers unknowingly pass through places where experienced locals understand one simple rule far better than any map ever could. What happened in this Appalachian ghost town still terrifies locals today. A freezing rain began to fall over the remote coal valley of Cinder Creek on the 9th night of October 1982. Local dispatch logs later showed that 3 separate emergency calls were placed from the mountain community within a 10-minute window. Each caller reported hearing a low and rhythmic thumping sound that seemed to vibrate directly through their living room floors. State records from that weekend indicated that the state police sent 2 troopers to investigate the unusual disturbance, When the officers arrived at the valley entrance, they found a deserted highway and a town that was completely dark. The local authorities never found a definitive explanation for why an entire community abandoned their homes in a single hour. Gideon Vance was a 38-year-old timber cruiser who spent his days assessing hardwood forests in Western Virginia. He had lived near the mouth of Cinder Creek his entire life and knew the steep mountain paths by heart. On that particular dreary morning, his only goal was to evaluate a dense stand of white oak near the ridgeline. He packed his iron marking axe and a worn leather field journal into the cab of his four-wheel drive truck. The morning air smelled strongly of wet coal dust and decaying leaves as he started his slow ascent up the mountain. He expected a routine day of measuring trunk diameters and noting boundary markers through the heavy mountain mist. By 4 in the afternoon, a dense and suffocating fog began to roll through the deep gaps in the mountain ridge. Gideon noticed that his pocket watch had stopped ticking entirely, which was highly unusual for a reliable mechanical timepiece. He packed his gear early and decided to walk back down toward the settlement before the mountain trail became treacherous. As he emerged from the tree line above the valley, he noticed that the entire town was shrouded in complete darkness. The streetlights were completely dead, and not a single window showed the warm glow of a lamp or a television screen. He quickened his pace down the gravel road to check on his neighbors at the local store. Gideon parked his truck outside the Cinder Creek General Store and walked up the creaking wooden steps to the front door. The air was deathly quiet, and the only sound was the steady dripping of rain from the rusted tin roof drainage. He pushed the door open and found the interior completely undisturbed, with the cash register drawer still closed tightly. A pot of fresh coffee was sitting on the cold burner, and several open ledgers were scattered across the counter. He shouted into the back storage room, but his voice only produced a faint echo against the unpainted wooden walls. He noticed that every single house along the main road had its front door swung wide open to the storm. County files from 1982 later revealed that the state troopers found 24 vehicles left parked in their driveways. Gideon walked into the small valley schoolhouse and discovered that the children had left their woolen coats hanging on the wall. A charcoal chalkboard in the main classroom still displayed a spelling lesson that was dated for that exact Monday morning. He discovered several domestic pets wandering aimlessly through the muddy alleys, but there was no sign of their owners anywhere. The entire settlement felt like an open grave where a vibrant community had suddenly vanished without a single cry. He drove to the neighboring county seat to report the massive and inexplicable abandonment to the state authorities. He spent the next 4 days working alongside state investigators who arrived to secure the eerie and silent perimeter. Gideon used his intimate knowledge of the timber tracks to help the search teams systematically comb the surrounding mountain ridges. They found no signs of violence, no broken windows, and absolutely no footprints leading into the dense laurel thickets. Witness statements from a nearby logging camp indicated that no vehicles had passed through the valley road since the previous evening. A state police investigator named Silas Vance found a bizarre detail inside the abandoned rail depot at the edge of town. Some locals from the next valley claimed that the ground had been trembling for days before the disappearance. Silas discovered a series of deep fractures in the earth that ran directly parallel to the old iron railroad tracks. Gideon helped the investigator measure the deep fissures, which emitted a faint and bitter odor that smelled like sulfur. They found dozens of abandoned flashlights and heavy miner helmets scattered around the entrance of an old ventilation shaft. The tracks inside the shaft led deep into abandoned coal workings that ran directly beneath the residential section of the town. Mining archives showed these particular tunnels had been closed down by the federal government back in 1965. Investigators never confirmed whether an illegal salvage operation had been active inside the dangerous and unmapped subterranean passages. The investigators recovered a waterlogged leather notebook from a metal locker inside the foreman office at the depot. Archived notes from a retired rail supervisor indicated that a massive underground pocket of methane gas had been expanding for months. The final handwritten entry described a sudden shift in the mountain bedrock that threatened to collapse the entire valley floor. The supervisor wrote that the air quality had dropped below safe levels and made an immediate evacuation absolutely necessary. They apparently fled into the deep mountain tunnels to escape the toxic fumes because the highway was blocked by a rock slide. Records conflict regarding whether the residents ever emerged from the complex network of interconnected cavern systems on the other side. The state authorities ultimately classified the valley as a permanent hazard zone and restricted all public entry with high fences. Gideon stood on the ridge months later and watched heavy machinery dump tons of gravel into the main valley entrance. The empty houses of Cinder Creek remained standing as rotting skeletons of a town that was swallowed by the mountain. Investigators closed the official file, but the true location of the residents remains a dark mystery among the regional population. The silent and overgrown valley is the only remaining reminder of the night an entire Appalachian community vanished into thin air. In this news story, most visitors entered Appalachia expecting breathtaking overlooks, quiet rivers, and endless forests painted with brilliant autumn colors. They planned scenic drives through mountain passes where every curve revealed another postcard view. Few realized those same roads carried generations of stories that never appeared in travel brochures. Long before highways connected distant towns, narrow mountain routes linked isolated communities that depended entirely on one another. Families remembered every bridge, every abandoned church, and every forgotten cemetery hidden among the ridges. Some roads eventually gained quiet reputations that locals rarely discussed with strangers. The warnings usually arrived as simple advice rather than dramatic ghost stories. Older residents suggested reaching the next town before sunset or choosing the longer highway instead of certain backroads. They almost never explained why. For most travelers, those conversations sounded like ordinary mountain folklore. Only years later did some realize they had unknowingly driven through places where unexplained experiences had been reported for generations. One autumn evening, the Harris family began what they believed would become another unforgettable drive through the Appalachian Mountains. Mark Harris enjoyed photographing abandoned structures, while his wife Jennifer preferred documenting forgotten churches, one-room schoolhouses, and historic cemeteries scattered throughout rural valleys. Their teenage son Ethan spent most trips recording video for a travel channel dedicated to overlooked destinations across America. They had already crossed thousands of miles without experiencing anything stranger than unexpected wildlife crossing the road. Careful planning, reliable equipment, and years of experience convinced them they understood mountain travel better than most tourists. Nothing suggested this journey would become the only trip they refused to repeat. Their route followed a collection of state highways winding through remote sections of eastern Appalachia, where towns sometimes stood nearly 40 miles apart. Cellular reception faded shortly after leaving the interstate. Paper maps replaced navigation apps because the surrounding mountains frequently interrupted satellite signals. The family welcomed the isolation. Modern distractions disappeared almost immediately, leaving only forests stretching endlessly beyond both sides of the pavement. Occasional wooden signs pointed toward communities with populations smaller than a single city block elsewhere in the country. Weather remained perfect throughout the afternoon. Blue skies reflected across narrow rivers flowing beside the highway, while cool mountain air drifted through open windows, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. Shortly before sunset, they stopped at a family-owned diner overlooking a small valley. Local residents filled nearly every table despite the quiet weekday evening. Conversations centered around hunting season, changing weather, and roads damaged during previous winters. When Mark casually mentioned their planned route across an older mountain highway, several conversations briefly stopped before continuing as though nothing had happened. Their waitress hesitated only long enough to ask whether they intended driving that road after dark. Mark answered yes, because the next motel remained less than 90 miles away. She nodded politely before recommending they leave immediately rather than waiting for dessert. Her tone carried concern instead of fear, making the advice strangely memorable. The highway narrowed within minutes after leaving town. Fresh pavement gradually gave way to older asphalt, patched repeatedly over decades. Guardrails disappeared along several steep curves overlooking valleys that vanished beneath growing darkness. Dense hardwood forests pressed tightly against both sides of the road until branches formed a tunnel overhead. Traffic became almost non-existent. During nearly 40 minutes, they encountered only one pickup truck traveling in the opposite direction. Its driver briefly flashed headlights twice before disappearing around the next bend. Jennifer assumed the signal warned about deer farther ahead. Ethan continued filming through the windshield, hoping to capture the fading evening light filtering between towering ridges. Darkness arrived much faster than expected beneath the forest canopy. Mark switched to high beams, revealing countless tree trunks standing like silent walls only a few feet beyond the pavement. Fog slowly gathered inside low valleys before drifting upward across the highway. Visibility remained acceptable, yet every curve looked strangely similar to the previous one. Ethan eventually lowered his camera after noticing something unusual. Mile markers seemed inconsistent. Marker 63 appeared first, followed several minutes later by marker 61. Another curve revealed marker 64 again. Mark assumed he had simply misread them while concentrating on the winding road. Ethan replayed his recording and quietly confirmed the numbers appeared exactly as remembered. Jennifer unfolded their paper map beneath the interior light. According to the route, they should have reached a small crossroads community nearly 15 minutes earlier. Instead, the forest continued uninterrupted in every direction. No driveways appeared, no mailboxes stood beside the pavement, even electrical lines seemed to vanish beyond the last ridge they crossed. The silence outside gradually became noticeable. Normally, mountain roads echoed with insects, distant streams, or occasional owls. Here, the surrounding forest appeared completely still, despite gentle wind moving across the higher slopes. When Mark lowered his window for several seconds, he heard nothing except the steady hum of the engine. Another 20 minutes passed before headlights illuminated an old white church standing beside the road. A narrow cemetery surrounded the building behind a weathered iron fence, leaning noticeably toward the hillside. Jennifer asked whether they could stop for photographs the following morning because moonlight gave the place an unusual appearance. Mark slowed slightly but continued driving. Less than 10 minutes later, Ethan looked up from his camera and quietly asked why they were passing the same church again. Nobody answered immediately. The identical leaning fence, cracked front steps, and broken stained glass window stood exactly where they had appeared before. Mark insisted another church probably resembled the first one because many rural congregations used nearly identical architecture. Ethan remained unconvinced after comparing both video clips side by side. The family finally reached a narrow bridge crossing a shallow creek. Beside the entrance stood an old wooden warning sign faded almost beyond recognition. Jennifer noticed a distinctive lightning-shaped crack running through one corner of the board. 15 minutes later, another bridge appeared. The same crack marked another weathered sign, standing in exactly the same position. Ethan searched his earlier footage again before quietly showing the screen to his parents. Every knot in the wood matched perfectly. Even missing paint formed identical patterns. Mark felt the first genuine wave of uncertainty since entering the mountains. He checked the odometer. According to the vehicle, they had traveled nearly 60 additional miles, yet every landmark suggested otherwise. Concern slowly replaced curiosity. Mark attempted turning onto the first side road they encountered, hoping it would reconnect with another highway. Less than 5 minutes later, the narrow lane curved unexpectedly before returning to the same main road from the opposite direction. The old bridge stood ahead once again. Jennifer suggested consulting a compass stored inside the glove compartment. The needle refused to settle in one direction, drifting slowly before stopping, then turning again without obvious reason. Ethan tried restarting his phone, even though no signal remained available. The digital map loaded briefly before displaying their location several counties away, then disappeared completely. None of the devices agreed with one another. Shortly after midnight, another vehicle finally appeared behind them. Relief spread through the family until Jennifer noticed something unsettling. The headlights never seemed to grow closer, despite following for nearly 15 minutes. They remained the same distance back through every curve, occasionally disappearing behind hills before returning exactly where they had been before. Mark reduced speed, hoping the driver would pass. The lights slowed as well. He accelerated slightly. They matched his pace again without gaining or falling farther behind. Ethan filmed through the rear window until the headlights vanished completely while rounding one sharp bend. The road behind them remained empty for miles afterward. Nearly an hour later, they reached a small gas station illuminated by a single fluorescent light. Relief quickly turned into confusion after discovering the pumps covered with rust and weeds growing through cracked concrete. Dust coated every window. The building had obviously been abandoned for years. Jennifer later recalled feeling certain she had seen the lights glowing from nearly a mile away, yet no electrical service appeared connected anywhere on the property. Ethan photographed the station before they continued driving. The digital timestamps on every image later showed conflicting times despite being taken only seconds apart. Some indicated photographs captured before they entered the highway, while others appeared almost 2 hours into the future. No explanation ever accounted for the corrupted sequence. The highway finally emerged from the mountains shortly before dawn. A larger state road appeared ahead, along with the first passing traffic they had seen in hours. They stopped at a convenience store where the cashier immediately asked whether they had spent the night on the old mountain route. Without describing their experience, Mark simply nodded. The cashier quietly explained that travelers occasionally arrived exhausted after believing they had driven in circles despite following the same highway. Most blamed heavy fog, unfamiliar terrain, or fatigue. Others refused, discussing the experience altogether. Local law enforcement had investigated numerous reports over the years, yet found no damaged signs, missing intersections, or roadway defects capable of explaining why unrelated visitors described remarkably similar experiences separated by decades. Back home, the Harris family reviewed every photograph, map, and video collected during the trip. Mileage records, timestamps, and recorded landmarks refused to fit into any logical sequence. Nothing proved anything supernatural had occurred. Mountain roads, exhaustion, changing weather, and human perception could easily combine in unexpected ways. Researchers studying navigation errors have long documented how isolated environments distort distance, direction, and memory, especially after dark. Even so, one detail remained impossible for the family to ignore. Ethan's continuous dashboard recording showed the same weathered church appearing twice without any visible turnaround, intersection, or break in the journey. Every attempt to retrace the route months later failed because neither the church nor the abandoned gas station could be located where maps indicated they should have been. Today, the family still visits Appalachia, but they never travel unfamiliar mountain roads after sunset. Whenever someone asks why, they simply recommend reaching the next town before dark, repeating the same quiet advice once offered to them without explanation. The new house seemed perfect until we heard someone upstairs. Deep within the historic suburban neighborhoods of Savannah, a young married couple purchased their beautiful colonial dream home. During the humid autumn of 2020, they completely renovated the massive historic wooden structure very carefully. What actually happened during their very first night indoors completely defies any basic, logical, modern scientific explanation today. Archive notes from the subsequent state police investigation describe a highly disturbing timeline of terrifying late-night events. 32-year-old Liam worked as a highly dedicated structural architect designing complex commercial office buildings daily. His highly capable wife was a 30-year-old financial accountant named Chloe, who frequently worked remotely indoors. Their primary professional goal required them to quickly establish a quiet, comfortable domestic life away from noisy apartments. The county file from 2009 actually mentioned several highly unusual trespassing complaints regarding this exact property. They officially arrived on October 12th and immediately began carefully unpacking their heavy cardboard boxes in the parlor. The first quiet afternoon passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents as the exhausted couple arranged their furniture. State records confirm the regional weather forecast predicted clear skies and dropping temperatures for that entire dark night. However, Chloe woke up shortly after midnight because she clearly heard strange, heavy footsteps echoing above their ceiling. She initially assumed a large, heavy animal was aggressively exploring the completely unfinished, dusty, wooden, dark, hidden attic. When she cautiously listened closer, the heavy, rhythmic footsteps instantly ceased completely in the cold, oppressive, silent house. Liam quickly discovered a highly bizarre, locked, heavy wooden door blocking the narrow hallway leading toward the stairs. The strange, unexplainable heavy door was perfectly solid, and it featured 3 massive modern steel deadbolts installed backwards. Some locals claimed a rogue, eccentric previous owner actively hid dangerous structural damage behind heavily reinforced wooden barricades. Investigators never confirmed those specific wild, unsubstantiated rumors and strictly maintained the property was entirely structurally safe generally. Liam carefully photographed the bizarre locked barricade and noted that the surrounding drywall showed extreme signs of stress. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically during that dark hour when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic mixed heavily with the sharp scent of sulfur. Both dedicated homeowners immediately started coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside their completely sealed bedroom. Liam quickly grabbed his portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional police department then. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid foundation and violently rattled the thick windows. Liam scrambled frantically toward the dark hallway and desperately aimed his high-powered security flashlight toward the ceiling. The glowing beam instantly revealed an enormous, intense, dark mass standing perfectly still directly behind the stair banister. The strange, dark anomaly lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal, bright ambient light entirely. Records conflict regarding exactly how long they silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing tall anomaly before it slowly retreated. Chloe frantically, urgently insisted they absolutely needed to completely abandon their newly purchased historic home and run outside. Liam completely strongly agreed, but they soon realized the main electrical breaker panel was constantly displaying erratic sparks. They were effectively hopelessly trapped inside a massive, unforgiving structural maze known for permanently confusing, highly experienced contractors. The desperate, anxious architect decided to blindly, violently run toward the front door, hoping to retrieve his keys. He confidently, blindly sprinted continuously through the freezing dark living room until he eventually physically discovered the entrance. Liam remained entirely, completely, silently hidden behind the thick, solid wooden couch while intensely listening for aggressive movements. Archived notes from Liam stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly. Every single time he abruptly, cautiously raised his head to firmly point out the hidden observer, they vanished. Utter physical mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced him to quickly, carefully establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected defensive position. He huddled tightly, safely, against the heavy metal radiator while strongly clutching a heavy steel flashlight for protection. Around 2 in the freezing morning, the surrounding dark, dense house suddenly fell totally dead silent entirely, completely. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath floorboards. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Savannah region, but geologists officially found nothing. Liam frantically, aggressively scanned the pitch-black distant hallway with his heavy flashlight, but the expensive battery died. He silently screamed internally in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped forward. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack the reinforced door, but simply stood motionless completely. Liam slowly, hesitantly gripped his heavy steel flashlight tightly, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly heavily trembling. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly, completely shattered the windows. Plunged into total, suffocating, pitch-black darkness inside the house, the terrified young couple blindly, frantically crawled desperately. They hopelessly, blindly waited continuously inside the highly secure, locked basement room until the early morning sunlight arrived. A commercial utility repair operator miraculously happily found the rural property completely devastated near the heavily designated street. The highly traumatized young couple was severely, badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations from glass. State records confirm they were quickly, safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully, safely navigated back to retrieve the abandoned property, they discovered chaos. The heavy, durable wooden interior doors were completely, entirely melted into toxic puddles and all metal hinges twisted. Liam was tragically completely unable to mentally process his terrifying experience despite the massive, highly coordinated psychological support. Highly trained tracking search dogs completely, entirely lost any distinct individual scent trails near the steep property edge. Law enforcement officials strongly, firmly suspected the blindly, quickly fleeing couple accidentally, entirely hallucinated the terrifying, massive entity. However, they absolutely could not logically, realistically explain how the heavy steel locks were completely melted by temperatures. The overwhelming, putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely unsolved. Chloe completely, permanently, fully abandoned her promising financial accounting career and rapidly moved to a highly bustling city. She completely, absolutely, strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding her terrifying, unexplainable house experiences. She eventually, quietly, safely, wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing her intense, lingering, severe trauma. Reportedly, she deeply, severely suffered from chronic, daily, heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, smooth entities. Dispatch logs routinely, regularly show she frequently, frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about heavy vibrations. The deep, dark, isolated suburban Savannah house remains mostly completely, thoroughly abandoned and deeply, heavily feared by residents. Experienced local rural real estate agents actively, aggressively, strictly discourage overly ambitious amateur novice buyers from exploring acreage. Official public state records conflict regarding the actual, total, highly accurate number of missing trespasser cases strictly linked. Some ambitious, independent, amateur internet investigators occasionally, dangerously, completely venture into the dark, unmarked house hoping for evidence. Most of them always safely return completely empty-handed, while a few others quickly emerge with unsettling stories. The absolute, total, complete lack of any definitive, hard physical evidence heavily, continually, profoundly frustrates those who believe. The completely destroyed internal security cameras conveniently, completely, permanently erased any potential digital visual proof of the entity. Vociferous internet online skeptics constantly, loudly, aggressively argue that sheer blind panic and total utter darkness easily transformed archived notes carefully, thoroughly gathered from the official local police investigation confidently, strictly concluded that an undocumented leak, yet the exact, highly specific, true physical origin nature of those massive, perfectly smooth, melted door frames remains. University biology science experts quickly, easily, permanently dismiss the crazy, ridiculous, bizarre idea of a completely unknown anomaly. They firmly, constantly, strongly argue that an active, healthy, massive biological population of large hidden creatures leaves evidence. No unusual biological organic hair samples or strange skeletal biological bone remains have ever been definitively positively linked. Some locals claimed the federal, national, centralized government quietly, aggressively, permanently suppressed the actual truth to protect operations. Investigators never confirmed any grand, illegal, hidden conspiracy and simply safely, permanently, officially closed the bizarre, terrifying case. In this new story, in September of 2022, the West Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police hosted its annual investigative conference in Charleston. Among presentations covering homicide investigations, search and rescue operations, and digital forensics, one session attracted unusual attention despite involving no confirmed crime. The presentation examined a series of unexplained incidents reported over nearly 3 decades by residents of small mountain towns scattered across Appalachia. None of the cases resulted in arrests, none involved identifiable suspects, and none were officially classified as criminal investigations. What connected them was something far more unusual. In every case, experienced investigators concluded that the available evidence supported the witnesses' accounts far more than anyone had initially expected. The first file discussed during the conference originated in Clay County, West Virginia, during November 2016. Shortly after 6 o'clock on a cold Friday evening, the owner of a family-operated hardware store contacted local deputies after discovering the business unlocked despite having personally secured it less than an hour earlier. Nothing appeared to be missing. Cash remained inside the register, expensive power tools were untouched, and surveillance cameras continued recording normally throughout the evening. Deputies initially believed an employee had accidentally returned after closing. Instead, the surveillance footage showed the front door unlocking from the inside without anyone appearing on camera. Investigators reviewed the recording repeatedly, confirming there had been no interruption, digital corruption, or evidence of tampering. The door opened slowly, remained open for approximately 20 seconds, then closed again without a single person entering or leaving the building. Forensic technicians examined the property the following morning, expecting to identify a mechanical malfunction or signs of forced entry overlooked during the initial response. The electronic lock functioned perfectly during testing, fingerprints recovered from both door handles belonged exclusively to employees, and alarm records confirmed the security system had never been deactivated. More surprisingly, investigators determined that the locking mechanism could not physically disengage unless activated either from inside the building or through an authorized access code. The owner confirmed no employee possessed remote access, while security contractors verified that no system errors had been recorded that evening. The investigation concluded without identifying how the door had opened, leaving detectives with evidence that clearly documented the event but failed to explain it. The second investigation came from a small community in eastern Kentucky during August 2018 after volunteer firefighters responded to repeated reports of lights appearing inside a long-abandoned elementary school scheduled for demolition. Residents living nearby insisted the lights appeared only briefly before disappearing again, often after midnight when no authorized workers remained on the property. Responding firefighters entered the building expecting to find trespassers. Instead, they found every classroom empty, windows secured, and electrical service disconnected months earlier. Utility records later confirmed no power had reached the building since the previous winter. Investigators considered portable generators or battery-powered lighting, yet exhaustive searches recovered nothing capable of producing the illumination described by multiple witnesses over several consecutive nights. Unlike rumors that often circulate through small communities, the reports from the abandoned school came from individuals who had little connection to one another. Statements were collected independently from delivery drivers, overnight highway maintenance workers, neighboring homeowners, and a deputy sheriff patrolling the surrounding roads. Each described lights appearing behind second-floor classroom windows before disappearing moments later. Traffic cameras positioned several blocks away failed to capture the phenomenon because the building sat beyond their field of view, leaving investigators dependent upon witness testimony supported only by repeated, unsuccessful searches. After nearly 2 weeks, the reports stopped as suddenly as they had begun, and demolition crews removed the structure later that autumn without discovering evidence that anyone had been occupying the building. The final case examined during the conference began in a mountain town along the Virginia border during January 2020. County Emergency Dispatch received several calls reporting that church bells were ringing shortly after 3 o'clock on consecutive winter mornings, despite the church itself having been closed for nearly 6 months while undergoing structural repairs. Maintenance contractors confirmed that the bell tower's electrical controls had been disconnected during renovation work and remained inoperable throughout the project. Deputies responding to the church found locked entrances, undisturbed snow surrounding the building, and no indication that anyone had entered the property overnight. Audio specialists later inspected the bell mechanism, concluding that it could not have operated without electrical power or direct mechanical force. No evidence supporting either explanation was ever found. Investigators reviewing the 3 incidents several years later noted that each initially appeared simple enough to resolve within hours. An unlocked store suggested burglary. Lights inside an abandoned school suggested trespassing. Church bells ringing before dawn suggested vandalism. Yet every investigation gradually moved away from those ordinary assumptions as physical evidence refused to support them. Surveillance systems functioned correctly, forensic examinations revealed no signs of criminal activity, and independent witness statements remained remarkably consistent throughout each inquiry. Rather than producing dramatic conclusions, investigators repeatedly found themselves eliminating one practical explanation after another until only the documented facts remained. During the conference discussion, veteran detectives emphasized an important distinction often overlooked by the public. None of the official case files described paranormal events, and none encouraged supernatural conclusions. Instead, the reports documented situations in which observable events occurred without leaving sufficient evidence to identify a conventional cause. Experienced investigators considered that distinction essential because unresolved cases demand caution rather than speculation. Even so, many acknowledged that these incidents remained memorable precisely because they resisted ordinary investigative methods despite careful documentation and extensive follow-up. Today, the 3 files remain archived within their respective county agencies, each carrying administrative classifications that simply identify the investigations as closed without resolution. The communities where the incidents occurred have largely returned to ordinary life, with new businesses replacing old storefronts, schools giving way to vacant lots, and church renovations long since completed. Yet among retired deputies, volunteer firefighters, and investigators who personally worked those cases, the stories continue to surface during conversations about the investigations that proved the most difficult to forget. Not because they revealed something supernatural, but because they demonstrated that even in the quietest Appalachian mountain towns, there are still cases where every available fact can be verified, every witness can be believed, and the truth can remain permanently out of reach. In this new story, 3 disturbing small-town horror stories. Part 1. The town where nobody locked their doors. Most people in the American heartland believe that absolute trust is a sign of a healthy and safe community. This account from a remote mountain village suggests that leaving your front door unlatched might be an invitation for disaster. In the isolated village of Blackwood Hollow, the local culture was built on the fact that no one locked doors. Harlan Reed was a 41-year-old postal carrier who walked the quiet streets of the Hollow every afternoon. He had lived in the town since 1982, and he knew the specific habits of every single neighbor. The locals believed that their safety was guaranteed by the surrounding mountains and the long history of their shared ancestors. Harlan enjoyed the predictability of his route because it allowed him to finish his work before the early winter darkness. He often dropped off packages directly inside the mudrooms of the elderly residents who could not easily reach their porches. This level of trust was the foundation of the town, and no one ever questioned the safety of the practice. The atmosphere began to change during the first week of November in the year 2021 without any warning. Harlan was delivering a heavy box to a Victorian-style home owned by a woman named Mrs. Gable, who lived. He pushed the front door open as he had done for 15 years, but he felt a sudden and sharp. The house was silent, and the air inside felt significantly colder than the crisp autumn breeze blowing through the yard. He called out for Mrs. Gable, but his voice seemed to be absorbed by the heavy curtains and thick rugs. He noticed that the furniture in the living room had been moved into a tight circle facing the front door. This was strange because the elderly woman was known for her obsession with keeping her home in a perfect state. Harlan left the package on the floor and stepped back outside because he could not shake the feeling of... He mentioned the odd encounter to the local sheriff named Silas Thorne while they were eating lunch at the diner. Silas suggested that the woman was simply redecorating for the upcoming holiday season in the Hollow, but Harlan remained. By the middle of the following week, Harlan noticed similar patterns in several other homes along his daily delivery route. Doors were standing wide open even when the temperature dropped below freezing and the residents were nowhere to be seen. He stopped at the home of a young mechanic named Elias Vance, who was usually working in his garage. The garage was empty and the tools were scattered across the concrete floor as if they had been dropped suddenly. Harlan walked to the back door and found it unlatched and swinging slowly in the damp and heavy wind. He entered the kitchen and saw 3 plates of steaming hot food sitting on the small wooden table in silence. The family was gone, but the television was still playing a local news broadcast from a city 50 miles away. He felt a sense of vertigo as he realized the residents had not simply walked away from their homes. Harlan decided to conduct his own investigation because the authorities seemed disinterested in the strange behavior of the quiet town. He returned to the post office and began to look through the historical archives of Blackwood Hollow from many decades. He found a series of newspaper clippings that described a similar event that occurred in the winter of 1950. Several families had disappeared from their homes overnight, leaving behind open doors and half-eaten meals on their dining tables. The reports mentioned that the only witness was a young boy who spoke about a tall figure wearing a hat. This figure reportedly walked through the streets and knocked on every door that was not properly secured with a bolt. Harlan realized that the current residents were following a tradition that they did not fully understand or even remember. They left their doors open because they believed it kept them safe from the thing that wanted to enter. He spent the next 3 nights watching the main street from the window of his small apartment above the pharmacy. The town was deathly quiet, and the only sound was the howling of the wind through the dark mountain passes. On the 3rd night, he saw a dark shape moving slowly between the houses on the far side of town. The figure was remarkably tall and wore a tattered coat that seemed to blend into the shadows of the trees. Harlan watched in horror as the figure approached the front door of the local grocery store and pushed it open. The figure emerged a few minutes later and moved toward the next house with a purposeful and steady gait. The next morning, he went to the grocery store to see if the owner, named Arthur, was still there. Arthur was sitting in the middle of the aisle, staring at the ceiling with a look of pure and absolute. He did not respond when Harlan called his name or when he shook him gently by the heavy coat. Harlan realized that the town was being harvested by something that used the open doors as an invitation to enter. The residents were not being taken by force, but were surrendering to a force they could not possibly hope. He returned to his apartment and finally did the one thing that no one in the town had ever. He closed his front door and turned the heavy brass deadbolt until he heard a loud and satisfying click. The scratching started at exactly midnight and continued for several hours as the entity circled the small and dark apartment. Harlan could hear the heavy breathing of the thing on the other side of the thin wooden door in silence. It whispered his name in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves in a very deep. The deadbolt held firm, and the scratching eventually stopped as the sun began to rise over the cold mountain. He finally gathered the courage to open the door and walk out into the streets of the hollow once more. The town was completely empty, and there was no sign of the residents or the tall figure in the. The open doors were still swinging in the wind, but the houses were now hollow shells of their former selves. The police files confirm that 100 people disappeared without a single trace of a struggle or a crime. Harlan Reed still lives in a city where every door is locked, and he never forgets the open doors. The mystery remains as deep as the woods and as old as the fear of the dark and the. This story serves as a reminder that some traditions are actually chains that bind us to a very dark. The silence of Blackwood Hollow is the only legacy left behind for those who chose to leave doors open. Part 2. Everyone heard screams. Nobody called the police. Most violent crimes happen in the shadows of the night when no one is around to witness the actual struggle. This story is different because it happened in the middle of a crowded neighborhood where every single person was listening. The bystander effect is a documented phenomenon where people fail to help when others are present in a large group. In the autumn of 2021, a small community in Ohio learned how dangerous this silence can truly be. Vance Whitaker was a 45-year-old retired machinery operator who lived in a brick apartment complex in Ohio. He liked the quiet nature of the suburbs because it allowed him to focus on his gardening and local woodcraft. On the night of October 12, 2021, he was sitting in his living room watching a classic film. The complex was designed with a central courtyard where residents often gathered to talk during the warm summer months now. At approximately 10 o'clock that night, a piercing scream echoed through the courtyard and vibrated against the thin glass windows. Vance paused his movie and looked toward the window, but he did not see any movement in the dark shadows. He noticed that the moonlight was casting long and jagged shapes across the brick walls of the apartment buildings tonight. He assumed it was just a group of teenagers playing a prank or perhaps a loud television in another unit. He waited for several minutes for a second sound, but the courtyard remained deathly silent under the dim yellow lights. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and the lingering smell of charcoal from a nearby grill. He decided to go back to his movie and ignored the nagging feeling that something was wrong in the complex. Another scream rang out 10 minutes later, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps running across the wet pavement below. Vance stood up and walked to his balcony, but he could only see the silhouettes of his neighbors looking out. No one was shouting for help, and no one was running outside to investigate the source of the terrifying noise. He saw the lights in the apartment across the way flicker on and then off as if someone was watching. Vance felt a sense of relief because he assumed his neighbors were already calling the police to report the disturbance. He sat back down on his worn leather sofa and tried to focus on the dialogue of the old film. The screaming stopped after 30 minutes and was replaced by the low hum of the wind through the courtyard trees. He went to bed shortly after midnight, convinced that the situation had been resolved by the local authorities already today. The next morning, he woke up to the sound of sirens and saw several police cruisers parked in the lot. Yellow crime scene tape was draped across the entrance to the courtyard where he had heard the screams last night. He walked outside and saw a group of his neighbors standing together with looks of deep confusion and mounting guilt. A detective named Silas Thorne began to knock on every door to ask if anyone had heard anything unusual recently. Vance told the detective about the screams and mentioned that he thought someone else had already called the emergency line. The detective looked at his notepad and informed Vance that not a single person in the complex had called them. There were 48 occupied units in the building, and every single resident admitted to hearing the screams that night. They all gave the same excuse, that they assumed someone else would take the responsibility for calling the police now. The victim was a 30-year-old woman named Elena Vance, who worked as a night shift nurse nearby today. She had been attacked while walking from her car to the front door of her building in the open air. The investigation revealed that the attacker had stayed in the courtyard for over an hour because he knew no one. He had moved with a calculated slowness because he realized the neighbors were watching but doing nothing to stop him. The forensic team found several discarded cigarette butts near the bushes where the attacker had waited for his next move. The most disturbing part of the case was the realization that the screams were not actually coming from Elena Vance. The detective found a small digital recorder hidden in the bushes that was programmed to play a loop of screams. The attacker had used the recording to desensitize the neighbors and see if anyone would actually step outside to help. Elena had been taken in total silence while the neighbors were distracted by the loud and artificial noise in courtyard. The police found her car door wide open and her keys still hanging from the lock in the driver's side. The twist in the investigation came when they reviewed the security footage from a camera hidden in the lobby area. The man who planted the recorder was not a stranger, but a resident who lived on the third floor now. His name was Julian Reed, and he was a quiet 38-year-old accountant who never caused any trouble. He had spent weeks studying the habits of his neighbors to ensure that his psychological experiment would work perfectly today. Julian did not want to kill anyone, but he wanted to prove that the community was built on false trust. He had taken Elena to a nearby warehouse and left her there safely to show how easy it was. The police found Elena unharmed, but the psychological damage to the residents of the complex was permanent and very deep. Every person who lived in that building eventually moved away because they could no longer look at their neighbors' faces. Vance Whitaker left Ohio a month later and moved to a small cabin where he did not have any neighbors. He realized that the silence of the woods was much safer than the silence of a crowd of indifferent people. The case remains a chilling reminder that we cannot always rely on others to do the right thing in moments. If you hear a scream in the night, you should be the one who makes the call to the police. The ending of this story sounds fake, but the police records confirm the strange details of the social experiment today. Some people want to watch the world burn, and others just want to watch their neighbors do absolutely nothing now. Local psychologists often cite the Blackwood Hollow incident as the perfect example of how urban isolation affects our basic instincts. It remains a mandatory case study for university students who are learning about the complex nature of human social behavior. The recorded screams are still kept in a secure evidence locker at the police station as a grim historical artifact. People who move into the complex today are never told about the night that everyone listened to the darkness alone. Vance Whitaker sometimes looks at the old news clippings and wonders if he would do anything differently if it happened. The silence of the neighborhood was a choice that 48 people made together without ever saying a single word. The world is full of sounds, but the most important ones are often the ones that we choose to ignore. Part 3. The family everyone avoided. Most people who live in the rural corners of northern Maine understand that privacy is a very respected local tradition. There was one specific household on the edge of the woods that made even the most hardened loggers feel uneasy. Beckett Lowry was a 45-year-old carpenter who supposedly moved into the old Miller estate in the winter. He was joined by his wife, Alara, and their young daughter, Maisie, who was rarely seen playing in the yard. The neighbors noticed immediately that the family never traveled into town to buy groceries or supplies like a normal family. They would only see the three of them standing at the edge of the dark forest during the late evening. The Lowry family stood perfectly still for hours while staring into the dense trees as if they were waiting there. No one in the small community ever dared to knock on their door or offer a warm welcome to the quote. The local mail carrier, named Arthur, was the only person who had any regular contact with the strange Miller property. He noticed that the grass in the front yard never seemed to grow despite the heavy rain of the spring. The windows of the house were always covered with thick black fabric that prevented anyone from seeing the interior rooms. In the summer of 1997, Arthur noticed that the mailbox was overflowing with letters and local circular advertisements. He walked up the porch steps and felt a sudden drop in temperature that made his skin crawl with dread. He looked through a small gap in the window fabric and saw the three family members sitting at the table. They were not eating or talking, but were simply staring at the front door with wide and unblinking pale eyes. Arthur dropped the mail and ran back to his truck because the silence from the house felt like He reported the strange incident to the local sheriff named Silas Thorne, who had been patrolling the area for years. Silas was a practical man who did not believe in local legends or the whispered fears of the nervous townspeople. He agreed to perform a welfare check on the Lowry family to ensure that no one was sick or hurt. The sheriff drove to the estate the following morning and found the front door was standing wide open and unlatched. He stepped inside the foyer and was immediately struck by the thick layer of dust covering every single piece of. It looked as if no one had lived in the house for at least 30 years despite the recent sightings. He walked into the kitchen and found the three family members sitting exactly where Arthur had described them the day. The sheriff approached Beckett Lowry and touched his shoulder, but the man did not move or respond to the contact. Silas realized with a shock that the bodies were not alive, but were perfectly preserved and very realistic wax figures. He searched the rest of the house and found a collection of old newspaper clippings hidden under the floorboards. The articles described a family named Lowry who had disappeared from a different state in the year 1967. The photographs in the newspapers matched the faces of the wax figures sitting in the kitchen with terrifying and exact. Silas found a journal in the basement that described a man who wanted to recreate his lost family forever today. The writer had spent decades building the figures and moving them around the yard to simulate a normal and living crumb. The neighbors had not seen a real family, but had been watching a grieving man move statues in the dark. The investigation revealed that the real Beckett Lowry had died of natural causes in the basement several months prior today. His body was found resting near a workbench filled with sculpting tools and various jars of heavy industrial grade. The mystery of why the neighbors saw the figures standing on their own remains a topic of local debate now. Some people believe the grief was so strong that it left a permanent stain on the old Miller estate grounds. The house was eventually torn down, but people still avoid the empty lot where the family used to stand. The forest is quiet now, and no one stands at the edge of the trees during the late evening hours. It is a reminder that the things we avoid are often much sadder than the monsters we usually imagine. The police files confirm that the Lowry family was never actually in the state of Maine during that time. For 20 years, nobody entered this Appalachian cabin. Deep in the dense wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, an abandoned cabin sat completely undisturbed for 2 decades. During the early spring of 2020, a determined property appraiser finally unlocked the heavy front door. What he discovered inside the dusty, rotting structure remains a highly debated topic among regional law enforcement today. Archive notes from the subsequent state police investigation describe a highly disturbing scene that defies simple logical explanation. 45-year-old Robert Hayes worked as a highly experienced municipal property appraiser for the rural county. His primary professional objective required him to evaluate abandoned, secluded estates for upcoming public tax auction property sales. The county file from 2009 mentioned a highly unstable structural foundation regarding this specific isolated property. He safely arrived on April 4th and immediately began carefully assessing the severely overgrown exterior of the structure. The first hour of his standard inspection passed entirely without any significant dangerous incidents or unexpected safety hazards. State records confirm the regional weather forecast predicted clear skies and moderate temperatures for that entire calm afternoon. However, Robert distinctly heard strange, heavy dragging sounds echoing slowly from the upper floor of the abandoned cabin. He initially assumed a large wild animal was aggressively building a nesting den inside the warm, dry attic. When he cautiously shouted a loud verbal warning, the heavy dragging sounds instantly ceased in the dusty darkness. Robert quickly discovered a highly bizarre set of massive, deep indentations on the original hardwood floor completely inside. The strange, unexplainable tracks were perfectly smooth in shape, and they pressed heavily into the solid oak planks. Some locals claimed a rogue drifter occasionally used the abandoned structure to hide stolen heavy commercial mining equipment. Investigators never confirmed those specific, wild, unsubstantiated rumors and firmly maintained the property was completely securely locked prior. Robert carefully photographed the bizarre, smooth floor damage and noted the stride length indicated a massive, heavy object. The highly stressful situation escalated drastically when an awful chemical smell suddenly arrived continuously throughout the entire floor. Reportedly, the foul, suffocating odor tightly resembled burning synthetic plastic, mixed heavily with the sharp scent of sulfur. The dedicated appraiser immediately started coughing violently and aggressively struggling to breathe properly inside the completely sealed room. Robert quickly grabbed his portable emergency radio to call for immediate outside medical assistance, but only received static. Dispatch logs show no emergency distress calls were ever successfully officially recorded by the regional sheriff that day. Suddenly, a massive, unseen, heavy physical force violently shook the solid foundation and partially collapsed the wooden staircase. Robert scrambled frantically toward the dark open hallway and desperately aimed his high-powered flashlight toward the ceiling. The glowing beam instantly revealed an enormous, intense, dark mass standing perfectly still near the broken attic hatch. The strange, dark anomaly lacked any discernible biological features and completely blocked the normal ambient light filtering indoors. Records conflict regarding exactly how long he silently, terrifyingly watched the imposing tall anomaly before it slowly retreated. Afternoon light quickly clearly revealed that his specialized digital measurement equipment was completely shattered into tiny, useless pieces. Robert frantically, urgently decided he absolutely needed to abandon his remaining inspection gear and hike toward his truck. He soon realized his reliable backup analog compass was constantly displaying completely erratic, unexplainable, heavy magnetic directional headings. He was effectively completely disoriented inside a massive, unforgiving wilderness region known for permanently confusing, highly experienced outdoorsmen. The desperate, anxious appraiser decided to blindly, consistently follow the overgrown driveway path, hoping it safely intersected pavement. He hiked for 2 grueling, painful hours through thick, thorny underbrush while constantly feeling intensely, directly, violently watched. Archived notes from Robert stated he repeatedly caught brief, terrifying glimpses of pale, smooth, large objects moving swiftly. Every single time he abruptly stopped to firmly point out the hidden observer, the pale, unknown shapes vanished. Utter physical, mental exhaustion eventually heavily forced him to quickly establish a completely vulnerable, unprotected rest stop briefly. He huddled tightly, safely against a large oak tree while strongly clutching his sturdy walking stick for protection. Around late afternoon, the surrounding dark, dense woods suddenly fell, totally dead silent, as wild birds completely stopped. A deep, guttural, mechanical humming sound slowly, continuously began to violently vibrate through the damp dirt beneath him. Some locals claimed strange underground natural gas releases occasionally plagued the Appalachian region, but geologists officially found nothing. Robert frantically, aggressively scanned the pitch-black, distant tree line with his heavy flashlight, but the battery died. He screamed out loudly in absolute, sheer, unadulterated terror when a tall, pale, smooth shape casually stepped forward. The towering, featureless, pale entity did not overtly, aggressively attack him, but simply stood motionless, completely staring blankly. Robert slowly, hesitantly reached for his heavy orange safety whistle, but his frozen, numb fingers were constantly trembling. The bizarre, towering, unknown creature emitted another deep, deafening, humming vocalization that violently, instantly rattled his internal chest. Plunged into total suffocating pitch-black panic, the terrified appraiser frantically ran into the treacherous dense woods. He hopelessly blindly sprinted continuously through the thick, tangled brush until he eventually physically collapsed near the highway. A commercial delivery truck driver miraculously happily found Robert wandering aimlessly near a heavily designated rural gravel shoulder. The older traumatized appraiser was badly dehydrated and suffering from multiple minor bleeding lacerations caused by branches. State records confirm he was safely, immediately transported to a local regional medical hospital and strictly treated. When heavily armed local police deputies eventually carefully navigated back to retrieve the abandoned property, they discovered chaos. The heavy, durable wooden cabin doors were entirely melted into toxic puddles and all metal hinges twisted. The intense subsequent official police investigation failed to produce any logical, rational, scientific answers regarding the strange destruction. Law enforcement officials firmly suspected a highly aggressive local squatter had simply violently rigged the deserted property. However, they absolutely could not realistically explain how the heavy wooden framing was completely melted by temperatures. The overwhelming putrid atmospheric sulfur smell and the highly localized underground ground vibrations also strictly remained completely unsolved. Robert fully abandoned his promising county property appraisal career and rapidly moved to a bustling, noisy city. He strictly refused to conduct any further public media interviews regarding his terrifying, unexplainable cabin experiences. He eventually safely wrote a highly obscure, completely anonymous internet blog detailing his intense, lingering, severe trauma. Reportedly, he severely suffered from chronic, daily heavy insomnia and constant, terrifying nightmares featuring tall, smooth entities. Dispatch logs regularly show he frantically called local urban police authorities, continually complaining about heavy vibrations. The true physical nature of what currently securely resides deep inside that rugged Appalachian cabin remains unspoken. What hikers reported deep in the wilderness still doesn't make sense. In late summer of 2011, several unrelated hikers reported nearly identical experiences deep within a remote section of western North Carolina. Their accounts were recorded months apart, yet many details appeared unusually consistent. Dispatch logs, archived ranger notes, and later witness interviews preserved fragments of those reports, though investigators never reached a conclusion that satisfied everyone involved. One of the earliest reports came from Corbin Voss, a 37-year-old survey technician from Tennessee who spent weekends hiking remote trails. He entered the Pisgah region alone during a 3-day backpacking trip and planned to document several abandoned logging routes. According to trail records, he checked in at a ranger station shortly after sunrise and appeared calm before beginning his hike. Weather conditions remained stable throughout the day, and no warnings had been issued for that section of forest. Corbin covered nearly 12 miles before establishing camp near a narrow ridge overlooking a heavily wooded valley. He later stated that nothing unusual occurred until shortly after dusk, when distant sounds began echoing through the trees. At first, he assumed another group occupied a nearby campsite, though no fires or lights appeared anywhere below him. The sounds reportedly resembled brief conversations carried by wind, yet every attempt to identify their source failed. Around 10 that evening, Corbin heard what he believed were footsteps approaching from the eastern side of camp. The movement stopped whenever he shined his flashlight toward the trees. Several minutes later, the same pattern repeated from a different direction. He described the experience in a written statement submitted after returning home. According to archive notes, he eventually remained awake until dawn because the sounds continued at irregular intervals. The following morning revealed no obvious explanation. Corbin found no footprints near his campsite, despite damp soil that should have preserved tracks clearly. He also noticed something that later became important during the investigation. Several small stones had been arranged beside the trail leading away from camp. The formation appeared deliberate, though investigators later suggested natural causes could not be ruled out. Corbin photographed the stones before continuing his hike deeper into the wilderness. Approximately 4 months later, a second report emerged from a woman named Tessa Crowley, a 42-year-old physical therapist from Virginia. She visited the same general region while training for a long-distance hiking event. Tessa reportedly knew nothing about Corbin's experience. Nevertheless, her statement contained details that closely matched information contained within county files from earlier reports. Rangers noticed the similarities only after reviewing records during the following year. Tessa spent 2 nights in the forest and described hearing distant voices after dark. She could never distinguish actual words, though the sounds consistently resembled conversations taking place beyond visual range. During her second evening, she reportedly heard footsteps circling her campsite for nearly an hour. Whenever she moved toward the noise, complete silence followed immediately. Investigators later confirmed that no other hikers had registered nearby during that period. The most unusual detail appeared shortly before sunrise. Tessa woke unexpectedly and discovered several stones arranged near a fallen log approximately 30 yards from camp. She later claimed the arrangement had not been present before darkness arrived. Archived ranger notes from 2012 mention photographs taken at the scene, though some records indicate those images were later misplaced. Investigators never confirmed whether the stones had any connection to other reports. As similar accounts accumulated, officials began examining earlier records stored in regional archives. A county file from 2009 referenced a search and rescue volunteer who described hearing distant conversations while assisting during a missing person operation. Another report from 2007 mentioned unexplained footsteps around a temporary camp established by forestry workers. Although details varied, recurring elements appeared often enough to attract attention from local authorities. By 2013, discussions about the reports reached several outdoor organizations operating throughout the Appalachian region. Some members believed environmental conditions created auditory distortions capable of producing convincing illusions. Others pointed toward wildlife activity, arguing that unfamiliar sounds frequently become exaggerated after darkness settles across remote landscapes. Investigators explored both possibilities, yet neither explanation accounted for every detail contained within witness statements. Records conflict regarding several observations, leaving significant gaps in the timeline. One incident from that year generated particular interest. A pair of hikers named Leland Burke and Owen Mercer entered the wilderness for a weekend photography trip. Both men were experienced outdoorsmen who routinely traveled through isolated terrain. According to their statements, they heard voices shortly after sunset while preparing dinner beside a stream. Neither individual could identify specific words, though both agreed the sounds resembled a conversation occurring just beyond sight. Leland later reported seeing a light moving slowly between distant trees across the valley. The light appeared briefly before disappearing behind thick vegetation. Owen claimed he never observed it directly, creating one of several conflicting details found throughout the case. Investigators never confirmed whether another group occupied the area that night. Searches conducted afterward located no campsites, discarded equipment, or evidence suggesting recent human activity nearby. The following morning produced another familiar discovery. Several stones rested beside the trail leading away from their campsite. Unlike previous reports, the arrangement formed a rough line extending toward denser forest. Leland photographed the scene and submitted copies during a later interview. Some locals claimed similar markers occasionally appeared throughout remote sections of the region. Investigators never confirmed those accounts and found little supporting documentation. As years passed, additional reports continued appearing within archived notes and ranger files. Many involved experienced hikers who demonstrated familiarity with wilderness conditions. Most accounts described sounds rather than visual encounters. Voices remained the most common element, followed closely by footsteps approaching campsites after dark. While each report contained differences, enough similarities existed to keep the mystery alive among those familiar with regional records. Researchers examining the case proposed several theories. Certain environmental specialists suggested unusual terrain features might reflect sound across valleys in unexpected ways. Under specific conditions, conversations occurring miles away could reportedly seem much closer than reality. Wildlife experts offered alternative explanations involving nocturnal animals whose calls occasionally resemble human voices. Neither theory addressed the recurring stone arrangements mentioned across multiple reports, separated by years and involving unrelated witnesses. A review conducted during 2019 attempted to organize every available statement into a single timeline. Investigators compared dispatch logs, archived notes, witness interviews, and state records gathered over more than a decade. Their findings revealed no evidence of criminal activity, organized hoaxes, or coordinated fabrication. However, they also failed to identify any explanation capable of connecting every reported detail. Several key documents referenced observations that could no longer be verified because supporting material had disappeared. Today, hikers continue traveling through the same wilderness without incident every year. Most never experience anything unusual and return home with ordinary stories about mountain views and long trails. Yet, scattered among those routine accounts remain a small number of reports that sound remarkably similar to statements recorded years earlier. Investigators never confirmed what caused the voices, the footsteps, or the carefully placed stones. Deep within that section of forest, what several hikers reported still doesn't make sense. In this new story, the Appalachian Mountains stretch for more than 2,000 miles across the eastern United States, passing through 14 states and thousands of small communities. Millions of people hike its trails every year without incident. Families camp beside its rivers, hunters disappear into its forests before sunrise, and retired couples spend quiet weekends driving its scenic roads. Yet, despite its popularity, there are stories that rarely appear in travel brochures or history books. They survive through sheriff reports, ranger journals, local newspapers, and conversations shared on front porches long after the sun goes down. Most of these stories are never presented as proof of anything supernatural. Instead, they are remembered because no investigation, no expert, and no witness has ever been able to explain exactly what happened. This is one of those stories. In the autumn of 2019, documentary photographer Aaron Mitchell accepted a commission from a regional history museum in North Carolina. His assignment was simple: spend 3 weeks traveling through the Appalachian Mountains, photographing abandoned schools, churches, railroad depots, and coal camps before time erased them completely. Aaron was 45 years old, meticulous, and unusually patient. He preferred working alone, often waiting hours for the right natural light before taking a single photograph. His reputation depended on accuracy, and he never embellished his experiences to make a story more interesting. Friends often joked that Aaron could spend an entire day documenting an empty building without speaking to another person. That quiet personality made what happened during his assignment even more difficult to dismiss. His journey began without incident. During the first week, he photographed abandoned mining communities across Southwest Virginia before crossing into eastern Tennessee. Every evening, he uploaded his photographs, backed up his equipment, and wrote detailed notes describing each location. Those journals would later become one of the most important parts of the investigation because they documented exactly where he traveled, who he interviewed, and what he experienced each day. Nothing unusual appeared until the afternoon of October 14th, when he stopped at a nearly forgotten mountain church outside a community that no longer appeared on most modern maps. The church had been built during the early 1900s and officially closed more than 20 years earlier after the congregation became too small to maintain the property. Local volunteers still cut the grass several times each summer, but the building remained locked except during occasional historical tours. Aaron spent nearly 2 hours photographing weathered wooden pews, stained glass windows, and handwritten hymn books left inside glass display cases. Before leaving, he met an elderly volunteer named Charles Morgan, who had cared for the property for more than 15 years. Their conversation focused mainly on local history until Charles unexpectedly asked whether Aaron planned to continue driving after sunset. Aaron answered that he hoped to reach another abandoned school nearly 40 miles away before spending the night in a nearby motel. Charles paused before quietly replying, "If you're still in the mountains after dark, don't follow lights that weren't there during the day." Aaron assumed the comment referred to hunters or private property and thanked the man before continuing east. By late afternoon, clouds settled across the ridges while temperatures dropped quickly. Shortly after 7, darkness covered the mountain roads completely. Traffic became almost non-existent, leaving Aaron alone with little more than the sound of tires against damp pavement. Around 8:15, while crossing a narrow ridge, he noticed a single light glowing through the trees several hundred yards above the highway. At first, he assumed it belonged to an isolated farmhouse. Less than a minute later, another light appeared farther along the same ridgeline. Then another. Within 5 minutes, 6 separate lights stretched across the mountainside. None moved, none flickered. They remained perfectly steady despite there being no visible roads or buildings nearby. Aaron stopped at a gravel turnout to photograph the unusual sight. Through the camera's viewfinder, the lights appeared unusually bright against the dark forest. He adjusted focus several times but could not identify their source. They looked too small to be houses and too steady to be flashlights. After taking several photographs, he climbed back into his vehicle and continued driving. Less than 10 minutes later, he rounded another bend and saw the exact same line of lights again, now appearing on a different mountain entirely. He checked his navigation screen to confirm he had continued east without turning around. The map showed no intersections capable of returning him to the previous overlook. Yet the pattern of lights looked identical, right down to their spacing across the ridge. The following morning, Aaron reviewed the photographs over breakfast, expecting to identify distant cabins hidden by darkness. Instead, every image showed an empty mountainside. The trees, ridges, and night sky appeared exactly as he remembered, but the lights themselves were missing. Thinking the camera had malfunctioned, he compared the digital timestamps. They confirmed the photographs had been taken during the exact period he remembered stopping beside the highway. Even stranger, his handwritten journal contained a sketch of the lights drawn immediately afterward while the memory remained fresh. Aaron rarely sketched anything unless he believed it might help identify a location later. Rather than dismissing the incident, Aaron returned to the same overlook the following evening under nearly identical weather conditions. He waited almost 3 hours. The lights never appeared. During the drive back, he stopped at a small diner where several longtime residents gathered each night after work. Curious, he casually mentioned seeing unexplained lights on the mountain. The conversation around him stopped almost immediately. Finally, an older woman seated near the window asked him a question. "Were they all in a straight line?" Aaron nodded. Without another word, the woman finished her coffee and quietly left the diner. No one laughed, no one offered an explanation. Instead, the owner walked over and changed the subject entirely, asking Aaron where he planned to travel next. Only after the other customers had gone did the owner explain why everyone became uncomfortable. Similar reports had circulated locally for generations. Hunters, utility workers, volunteer firefighters, and even state forestry employees occasionally described rows of steady lights appearing where no structures existed. Search teams sent to investigate never found electrical equipment, campsites, or evidence anyone had been on the ridges at all. Aaron spent the next several days researching county archives instead of photographing abandoned buildings. Inside a historical society office, he discovered newspaper clippings dating back to the 1950s describing unidentified mountain lights observed by unrelated witnesses across different decades. None of the reports claimed anything supernatural. Most suggested atmospheric conditions, distant vehicles, or optical illusions. Yet each investigation reached the same conclusion. No explanation fully matched the observations because the lights often appeared where roads had never existed. One forestry report even noted that helicopters flown over the reported locations during daylight found nothing but dense, untouched forest. When Aaron returned home, he organized the material into a presentation for the museum that had hired him. To the surprise of his colleagues, he removed every reference to the lights before the exhibit opened. Later, one curator asked why he excluded what seemed like the most interesting part of the assignment. Aaron's answer was simple. The photographs couldn't prove what I saw. The witnesses couldn't prove what they remembered. But none of us could explain it either. Years have passed since Aaron's journey through the Appalachians. The museum still displays his photographs of abandoned churches, forgotten schools, and empty coal towns. Visitors admire the images without realizing one chapter of the trip was intentionally left out. Somewhere among those mountains are ridges where experienced hunters refuse to chase distant lights after sunset, not because they believe every story they have heard, but because too many ordinary people with nothing to gain by inventing them, have described the same impossible sight for more than half a century. Perhaps there is a perfectly ordinary explanation waiting to be discovered. Or perhaps the Appalachian Mountains still keep a few stories that no one has ever been able to explain.